Hello everyone, welcome back. We are going to talk today about the revolution in culture that took place in Japan during the early, and really the early mid Edo period up until the end of the Edo period, which is to say that culture became much less a thing that was produced and consumed by elites, as it was a culture that was produced mostly, or in many important new ways, that was produced by commoners, certainly by samurai as well, but that had the majority of its drive coming from the commoners, and that was consumed by everybody in Japan, regardless of class. The start of a real popular culture in Japan, the start of what we can kind of start to think about as national culture, even though modern history is very different, and nationalism is something that we really don't cover in this class in much detail, because after 1868, when our class ends, that's when you really get the introduction of modern nationalism, and things in Japan really change, in large part as a result of contact with the outside world. But really, these changes that we're going to be talking about today kind of made all of that possible. And these changes were actually something resulted from processes that were not just pushed on Japan from the outside, but which really started from the culture, the economy, just the world of Tokugawa Japan. So many of the roots of Japanese modernity, of modern Japan, of Japan today as we understand it, many of those roots are indeed from the Edo period. Many of them are originate in the samurai class as well. So it certainly, there were a lot of influences on Japan from the outside, but the background that was there is what will be, the formation of that background is basically what we'll be talking about today. Economic sophistication, the growth of the Japanese economy, is really what made this explosion in popular culture possible, and in many ways bound the country together between the different social status groups. As we've mentioned before, Osaka became a clearinghouse, a major center of product storage, distribution, resale, the seat of many powerful houses, powerful merchant houses, and the formation of nationwide networks of merchants, and also nationwide networks of merchants who interacted with local samurai, and kind of who got protection from feudal lords to practice their business, kind of giving them a protected area in which they could develop, and then later expand into real nationwide organizations. So in Osaka, where everybody took their rice to market, essentially, you had a association called the Dojima Rice Exchange, which I briefly mentioned before, but it was a clearinghouse for rice, for this commodity that people needed, but which was also a unit of value of the economy, because it was so ubiquitous and because it was valued very highly. You could eat rice, and it kind of tended to back its own value up. And these merchants who basically traded on this exchange, who interacted with agents from domains, samurai agents, who also made contact with these merchants, and also in some cases speculated in rice. These partnerships became more and more important. you got the formation of, for example, leagues of merchants in provinces like Omi, which is right in the center of Japan, just to the east of Kyoto. Omi merchants became famous throughout Japan as shrewd negotiators, and also as people just possessing an immense amount of capital, which they could move around from domain to domain, and you wanted these people on your side. So if a organization who was associated, or a merchant who was associated with this organization, if he came to your domain, or if somebody made an introduction, you really wanted to cultivate these people. So the merchants are certainly benefiting from the daimyo. They're getting places where they can set up their operations. Sometimes they're getting favorable treatment in all sorts of ways, exemption from import tariffs or things like that. And in return, they become more and more avenues of funding for local daimyo. As the economy became more sophisticated, and as samurai incomes did not increase, the merchants eventually became much wealthier than the feudal lords, in some cases more wealthy than the feudal lords, who backed them up. And the lords took out loan after loan after loan from the merchant, and some of these were certainly not expected to be paid back. It depends on the circumstance of the loan, but very many of them were. And many daimyo actually fell into debt to these great merchant organizations as the time period went on, to such a degree that, in effect, the merchants took over the management, in some cases, not in all cases, the management basically of domain finances, because you had to keep servicing the interest that came with some of these debts. Some domains were able to weather the economic crises of the 18th century, which we'll be talking about more, and the reason that many daimyo went broke, better than others, but for many domains this became a necessary evil, but also an arrangement that in effect meant that important areas of domain business were now handled not by samurai but by merchants. These merchants made their fortunes in a variety of different pursuits. In many ways, they found many ways to capitalize on local products. For example, timber from central Honshu, and import goods coming up through Nagasaki, through the Ryukyu Kingdom, and sometimes also through the north, which we'll be talking about more. But mining, manufacturing, brewing. So really, by the end of the Edo period, what you're seeing is an environment where you have great merchant houses that function essentially according to the laws of supply and demand. There's many elements of modern capitalism there. They take money, invest it into other enterprises, turn it into more profits. They're in relations with their laborers, very closely approximate the relationship between boss and employee in some ways in the West. You do have a different political climate in which they're operating. Once again, this is feudalism, they're protected by their lords. But these merchant houses, and in general the amount of money that is now flowing through the economy, the existence of a market, really helps Japan transition to modernity, to at least a modern economy, when European imperial overtures basically make it clear that Japan has to do this in the mid-19th century. So the economy was definitely exploding, and the samurai had to get used to dealing with that. Why was the economy exploding? Well, there were several reasons, but the most important of which is that, well, and these merchants were one of those reasons, and their activities and new ways of looking at supply and demand. But basically, I think the most important reason has to be the population explosion that also happened during this time period. So at the start of the Edo period, right, in about 1600, the population of Japan was around 18 million. By the middle of the Edo period, that is, by the early to mid 18th century, the population of Japan was about 30 million. It just exploded in a very short amount of time. Then it stabilized, and then by 1872, it had only risen an additional 3 million. So in about 125 years or so, the population of Japan had almost doubled. And why? Why did this double? And of course, there were more people buying, more people making stuff. So, the economy definitely improved because of that, got more sophisticated. Now, why? Why did the population explode so much? Well, I think peace had a lot to do with it. If there is less wars, less people are being drafted into the army, killed, less peasants are keeping their birth rate artificially low because they're worried about how they might feed new children they bring into the world. All sorts of considerations. Peace was good. And also, you do have the adoption throughout Japan of new agricultural techniques. And I'll be very honest with you, I'm not an agricultural specialist. I'm not really clear about exactly what happened, but I've read the literature which points to new crops, new strains of rice that are hardier, that are more able to stand the cold, that are more able to stand fluctuations in temperature or moisture. You had new planting techniques, and you had more fertilizer. And this I do find fascinating and understand a little bit better. You had new sources of fertilizer, or you had sources of fertilizer that were either new or that were greatly expanded. People had always used human night soil as fertilizer. Basically, you do your business into a public latrine, and then the muck is then later spread over the fields, and that does contain nutrients that help plants grow. During the Edo period, this kind of system was rationalized and kind of reduced, well, not reduced, kind of reimagined as a form of a very well-regulated kind of a municipal service almost. Something between a service and a duty, actually. People had common latrines, well, not latrines, these are actually pretty nice as far as outhouses go, but commoners who lived in the city and villagers, they shared these bathroom facilities, and the soil was then taken out of them by people who were tapped to be responsible for doing that kind of thing. Usually these were the so-called hinin and eta, these people who were despised in Japan as basically the untouchables, because it was seen that they had polluted themselves by coming into contact with pollution. These outcast communities who we've talked about before, but basically this was processed into fertilizer, then taken out into the countryside and spread on fields. It was actually it was good business. Also, another new source of fertilizer that became extremely important was marine fertilizer. especially processed nishin, mackerel. Processed mackerel? No, not mackerel. Oh my goodness, what is nishin in English? Anyway, a processed whitefish, I believe mackerel, or herring? I believe it's herring. Anyway, this fish that you caught in very large numbers, and the farther north you went, the more herring there were, which is also why Ezo became ever more important during the Tokugawa period, as the Howell article talks about. You caught this herring, you pressed it, and then you took the oil, and then you processed the muck into fertilizer, you dried it, and it was actually really, really good, very successful at making crops grow. And during the Edo period, imports of this processed fish fertilizer from the north drastically increased, and farming really was never the same after that. The same amount of land could now feed more people due to all of these things that we were talking about. Distribution of goods also played a large part in helping population growth, I think. There was ever more coastal shipping as there was ever more peace. The pirates of the inland sea, they had been repressed, and many of them actually became legitimate samurai. They kind of were able to retire from the piratical activities and join the ruling class. And so you could send boats from place to place for a shorter distance hauling. You could rely on the roads fairly well, and then once you got into the big cities, some were just made to be centers of consumption. Edo, for example, was built on a series of canals and rivers, and you just basically took your boat into the harbor, and you passed under the bridges of Edo, and you took your goods to market. Or I'm sorry, if you were selling fish, you usually did that, or you could something perishable, or you could drop them off into a series of riverside and canal-side warehouses. And so you had food, you had material to make clothing and manufactured clothing and all sorts of luxuries that could get from place to place, and that certainly helped the economy expand, and especially it helped to feed the ever-growing cities. Japan during the Edo period remained overwhelmingly a agricultural country, and yet cities became much bigger and much more important, and certainly Edo was one of these cities. You have, as I've mentioned before, the phenomenon in the early modern period that cities always consume people. The birth rate in a city is almost always lower than the death rate, and so you're really depending on constant migration of people from the countryside to replenish the population in the city. But even given the fact that cities kind of consume people, they certainly, not everybody dies, and you do get the creation of these new population centers that are swelling with ever more migrants coming in from the countryside, with seasonal visitors, many of them being samurai, and the ability to feed all of these people because goods are now moving around much better and there are more goods to move around. And so the population of Edo basically became greater than 1 million, making it one of the most populous and certainly one of the most impressive cities during the early modern period.